Okay, today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Kafet. Today's daf is sponsored by Ellie Gelman and Becky Portnoy in memory of their father, Jerry Bach, Yosef Menachem ben Yaakov Yehuda, and Leah Zichrono Livracha on his 30th yahrzeit. A father of daughters, he taught us that we could do anything we dreamed of. And by Tali and David Clements in honor of the birth of their daughter, Brielle Ava, whom they hope will grow up with a love of Torah, inspired by those who work to empower women to become leaders in Jewish learning. Cycle of life. Okay, we're going to start now at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. Before we start, I wanted to mention two things about yesterday. I forgot to mention, I wrote it down, but I didn't, while I was teaching, I kind of forgot, which is that the Smag has a very interesting, the Smag is the Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, and he wrote specifically about Shlomo and this idea that Shlomo instituted Netilat Yadayim and Eruvin. And why is that? If you remember, we saw a few days ago that in time of war, remember the issues in time of war, you don't need to do Netilat Yadayim and you don't need to do Eruvin, remember, because you're in a time of war and therefore certain things you don't have to do. So because of that, he said it was very apropos that Shlomo HaMelech was the one who instituted these things, because it was the first time in a bit, right, many, many years since Yoshua conquered the land, that there weren't wars going on all the time. And because of that, when it was a time of peace, he said, now's a good time to institute these things. It wasn't really a good time until then, okay, which is I thought was a nice idea there. And if you want to learn more about Netilat Yadayim and the whole takana, so in Daf Michelle Farber, if your Hebrew is good, you can listen specifically. They talk about what's the issue, why we wash our hands nowadays, where this comes from, and how it all connects with the purity and impurity of those days. Okay, starting now with the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. We started darshaning all sorts of things from Kohelet and Mishlei and now shiur. And therefore, we're continuing along. This is not exactly directly connected to what we're doing, but we darshan more things from shiur. So it talks in shiur about kfutzotav taltalim. His curls are the hair, or her hair is curly, right? Or actually, no, it's him. It's the dode. His kfutzotav are curls. They're full of curls. Here comes the drasha on this. They make a drasha on the kfutzotav, taltalim. The kfutzotav are kots on every little notch on top of every letter of the Torah, on the letters of the Torah. Right? There's those crowns that come out. On every crown, you can darshan mounds upon mounds of drashot, okay, of halachot. You can learn lots of things from each one. Shchorot ka'orev, this is the continuation of the pasuk. They're black like a raven. Okay, what does this mean, black like a raven? We're going to have three different interpretations. B'mi atamotzan, where would you find someone who can do this? And who is capable of doing these drashot? B'mi shemashkim u'ma'ariv alehem lebeit hamidrash. Someone who wakes up early and goes to sleep late in the Beit Midrash. Basically, they're learning all day and all night, sleep for a very short time. How do you get this from black like a raven? Okay, especially if you translate it into English, it really doesn't connect. But if you look at the Hebrew letters here, shchorot comes from shachar, shacharit, morning. And orev, the root is erev, evening. So they say, if you're in the morning and the evening in the Beit Midrash, then you will be able to darshan these things. Okay, this is basically what makes a great Talmid Chacham, someone who learns all day and all night in the Beit Midrash, or early in the morning, late at night. Doesn't mean all night. Rabba Amar, second interpretation, b'misha mashchir panav alehem ka'orev. It's not a matter of how much time you spend in the Beit Midrash, it's how hard you work. Okay, it's a matter of hard work. Right? Generally, you get black with hard work. I thought maybe it's if you stand outside all day, your skin gets very dark. Or maybe we had that story about Rabbi Yeshua, who is a pchami, he worked with coals, and because of that, he was black, right? You get yourself black and dirty when you work all day. So that's what it means. If you work really hard and you toil in it, then you'll be black like a raven is black, okay? Not having to do with a raven and not having to do with the root of the words, but like the color of a raven. Third interpretation, and this one is a little more difficult to absorb. Rava Amar b'misha mesim atzmo achzari al banav al bnei beito ka'orev. What do we know about an orev? One of the things about a raven is the raven ignores his young. Okay, doesn't provide food for them. There's some verses in the Torah that reference this. That noten lachma, right? Noten lachma livnei orev, or something along those lines. It's in Tehillim that we say every day, in Pesukei de Zimra. So it's the God has to provide for them because the raven doesn't provide for his young. So this is someone who goes to the Beit Midrash, leaves his children behind, and doesn't provide for them. That's the kind of person that's going to be able to do this. Okay, now this is a little bit difficult because, right, we don't really, the idea of leaving your children to go learn Torah isn't so great, it's hard to understand. And here they even bring a proof from someone who did this. Ki had Rav Ada bar Matna, hava ka'azi lebei Rav, he went to learn at the house of Rav. Amar le debitu, his wife said, Yenuke didach ma yavelu, what am I going to do with my children? Your children, she says even, right? Your children, how am I going to provide for your children? So he says, Amar la, mishlimu korme ba'agma. He says, what? Are the kormim in the agam, okay, the rushes in the marsh, are they finished? In other words, go collect some, something growing in the marsh that people don't generally eat. Go collect that, right? You can always find something for the kids, and I'm going to learn. It's very difficult for us to swallow. How could we say that this is an ideal? And we have all these other statements. We even just talked about it the other day, about the greatness of a Talmid Chacham is someone who, right, the Talmidei Chachamim in the Sadot, right, that they were out in the fields working and also made time to learn. So what is this? So maybe one can distinguish between those who are the average person who basically should be providing for their family and learning versus the unique individuals that are going to be the ones that are going to darshan, the tilei tilim, right? The every coats and coats. Maybe there's some unique individuals, and this goes with the Rambam. The Rambam talks about to be zocha for the keter of Torah, you shouldn't sleep and you shouldn't, right? And there's a few yechidei skula, as we call them, right? Unique individuals that we could say this for, whereas other people, the average person isn't going to work out so well. And we shouldn't necessarily promote this to everybody, but maybe there's some unique individuals that this is appropriate for. And then what's interesting is, though, he doesn't say the community should provide for you. And that goes with the statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, which is, right, better to eat bitter food than to eat sweet food, right? Bitter food that you worked for yourself than to eat sweet food that people gave you. And that's why he doesn't say to his wife, go live off tzedakah, right? And have the community support you. He says, go find, maybe not the most edible food, but something to eat and make do with that. Okay, it's obviously, if you look from the woman's perspective, it doesn't sound so great. She's kind of stuck on her own. And there are stories about this in the Gemara, about rabbis who left their wives to go learn. And some of them were considered, right. And this, I see people in the chat are talking about this, where there's these two famous stories, one about Rabbi Akiva who left home to learn and was praised. And one about Rabbi, I think it's Hananya ben Chanilai, who basically leaves his wife and doesn't connect with her, doesn't anything. And he was viewed as, it was a negative story. So it depends how you do it also is also a bit of an issue. Although this one seems pretty harsh, go deal with it yourself and manage. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. Umishalem l'sonav el panav lahavido. Now we're getting into how does God reward the Rishaim? Okay. We're now going to talk about God. Even Rishaim, we've talked about do good things. And now we're going to talk about something that appears many times, this approach of the Gemara of understanding how Sachar and Onesh works, how reward and punishment, and how tzaddikim get rewarded or not rewarded in this world, and the Rishaim, what happens to their rewards, and how does it work? And we're going to see this right now, so I won't give any more intro. The pasuk in Devarim, it says, "U'mishalem l'sonav el panav lahavido." God, it's a little hard to translate this verse. God gives the reward to the people he dislikes, el panav lahavido, to his face, in order to destroy him. Okay, it's a little bit strange what this means. So Amar Yeshua ben Levi, it's hard to understand the pshat. The pshat is el panav, is to the panim, to the face of the bad person. The son of Hashem is, we assume, is a rasha. So now he says, Amar Yeshua ben Levi, ilmalei mikra katuv i'afshar la'omro. This is a great line. If the verse hadn't written this, I wouldn't have been allowed to say it. In other words, we would never think to say such a thing on our own. It would be disgraceful to God to explain it like this. But look, the verse says it, so we have to explain it this way. And why is this? Because it's kind of, this is like what we say, sometimes it's like treating God like man and saying something that a human would do, but you wouldn't expect it of God. What is this? They're now saying the panav is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the face of God. It's like someone who's carrying a burden on his face, and all he wants to do is to get rid of it. What does this mean? When God rewards Rishaim in this world for the good deeds they do. But he does it in a way he just wants to get rid of it. In other words, I want to be done with this. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm not really interested in giving you a reward, but I want to just give it to you, and I'm just giving it to you right now, quickly. Okay, and that's why it's a little bit disrespectful to God to say such a thing. Why would God want to, get rid of the reward for the tzaddikim, for the rishaim? But that's what they say. So since the verse says it, that's how we explain it. The continuation says, Lo ye'acher l'sono. Okay, so what does this mean? He doesn't delay, and this is why they assume he throws it off of his panim as if I want to get rid of this. Amar Rabbi Hila l'son avhu delo ye'acher, aval ye'acher l'tzadikim gemurim. God quickly gives them their reward, whereas when it comes to tzadikim, he doesn't give them their reward so quickly. Now, what is this based on? It's based on this idea that someone who is a rasha, God wants to give him all his rewards in this world so that there's nothing left in the future, in the world to come, and then he'll get his punishments. But when it comes to a tzaddik, God reserves the rewards, and he doesn't give him rewards in this world. And this is how we explain tzaddik beralo and rasha v'tovlo, because, why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? Because God wants to, everyone does something bad, so God wants to give them the punishments in this world so that in the future world, he'll only get his rewards. And therefore, he delays the reward for the tzaddikim. This is something that comes up many times in the Gemara. Again, how much we can really understand of this, nobody really knows how God works. The rabbi is giving a possible explanation for this issue of how could be that good things happen to bad people and the reverse. Okay, continuing. V'hainu da'amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and here we have a statement of his that supports this. Okay, the first part isn't going to be connected, but the second part will be. Moshe says, "V'shamarta et mitzvah." You should do the mitzvah and the chukim and the mishpatim that I'm commanding you today to do. Now, why today to do? So they say two drashot on this. Like I said, the first one's not going to connect. Hayom la'asotam v'lo lamachar la'asotam. In other words, it's not the hayom is not saying I commanded you today. It's today to do, meaning do today and don't delay till tomorrow what you can do today, because who knows where you'll be tomorrow. That's one drasha. And now he says, Hayom la'asotam lemachar lekabel scharam. The second drasha is, you're going to do it today, but you might not see the rewards for a long time to come. And that supports what we just said. Okay. Amar Rabbi Chagai v'itema Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani my dichtiv erech apayim. Okay, another drasha. Why does it say that God, this is in the 13 attributes of God, the divine attributes, erech apayim? It should be erech af. Should be singular, right? That God is slow to anger, but it should be it should just be af as anger. It shouldn't necessarily say apayim in plural. So what do they say? Why does it say it in plural? Ela erech apayim letzadikim, erech apayim lerishaim. He delays, right? He delays two things. He delays the reward for the tzadikim, and he delays the punishment for the rishaim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer abet satayim. Okay, we finished the Agadata. Now we're moving back to our topic. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda debated with the rabbis. The rabbis said if you put up pasei b'ra'ot, it doesn't matter how big your space is, it still works. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a limit. Once it's beit satayim, which again was based on the measurements of the courtyard in the Mishkan, which was 100 by 50, which is 5,000 square amot, which comes out to approximately either between 11 and a half, right? Wait, am I right here? No, that was a different number. It comes out to what, about 109 feet. Wait, no, I'm confusing the numbers. What was it? 109. Yeah, 1 second. 109 times 109. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's 109 feet by 109 feet approximately. Okay, in meters, it's about 33 by 33 meters. Okay, that's the shetach, which comes out to, what did I just calculate, right? According to that, it comes out to about 12,000 square feet, okay? And there's a range, but it's approximately between 12,000 and I think 14 and a half or 14, something like that. So that's the space. It's not a huge space, by the way, okay? So anyway, once you have a space like that, what's the concern? If we allow a space like this with the pasei b'ra'ot, people will think that also in a karpaf, which is a big space that's surrounded but not lidira, right? It's not used for living space. People, and that is limited to a beit satayim. So because of that, we're worried that you might end up carrying in a space like that if we allow it here. So that's Rabbi Yehuda's concern. So now the question is, what are we so worried about? Okay, from which perspective? And now we're going to see, what are people looking at that they're going to say? Is it just the be'er, or is it the be'er and where the mechitzot stand and the space around? Okay, we're going to see this right now. Ibayelhu. Bor upasim ka'amal, which would mean that only if the space with the here they call it a bor, even though it's really the be'er, okay? And later we'll see today the Mishnah where they distinguish between bor and be'er. But let's just assume we mean our well. We have a well. The well, let's say, is Beit Satayim. Rabbi Yehuda says until Beit Satayim, you're okay. So if you have the well in the space of Beit Satayim, the well itself is Beit Satayim. Now, what do we say? The pasim, the mechitzot that you're making, have to be at least, right, 2 amot away, which means that now the whole space is going to be more than Beit Satayim. So let's say your well is exactly Beit Satayim. Does Rabbi Yehuda say that's okay? Because is it the bor and the pasim that can't be Beit Satayim together? O dilma bor velo pasim kamar. Or is it just the bor itself? So if we include the space with the pasim when we talk about the Beit Satayim, then in this case, your be'er is Beit Satayim. The space around is now going to be bigger. It's no good. Or do we say it's just the be'er itself? In which case, we're going to say that you're fine because your be'er is Beit Satayim. That measurement is okay. Any bigger than that will be a problem. So now the Gemara shows both sides of the question. And what does it depend on? Well, what are people looking at? When they look and say, oh, this is allowed, you're allowed to carry here. Are they focusing on the bor? Are they looking kind of inward? Or are they focusing outward on the mechitzas? So that's what they say right now. Adam notein einav biboro. This is a good example where the Gemara is trying to figure out how does a general person behave? What are they noticing? What are they looking at? Are they looking specifically at the well? Is that the center? What do you call it? Like their point of focus. Is that their point of focus? Is it? Do we say he's looking at the bor, and therefore, if the bor itself is Beit Satayim, then lo gazlina dilma ate l'tatuli yoter Beit Satayim. Then we're not worried that he's going to think in more than Beit Satayim because the be'er itself is only Beit Satayim, exactly. And then it's not a concern. Or do we say, o dilma adam notenena b'mechitzato? No, people are focusing on the mechitzot and saying, oh, look, the mechitzot are what allows us to carry here. And look, the space within the mechitzot is more than Beit Satayim. And therefore, gazlina dilma ati lechlufe yoter Beit Satayim bekarpath. And then we're worried people will say, oh, if I could carry in this space, and this space is bigger than Beit Satayim, I could probably carry, because why is this similar to a karpath? Because again, these are mechitzot that are not surrounding a space where anybody lives. Nobody's living within this space. And therefore, people will think that I could carry there. So that's the big question. So the Gemara is going to bring a braita to try to prove it. And this braita, we already saw the whole beginning part of the braita before, but we didn't see the last line, and that's the important part for our purposes. So first we'll review. And not only did we see this braita, but it's very, very similar to our Mishnah. How close can the pasim be, the corner pieces? Right? You have to have enough space for the head and the majority of the cow to be inside. How distant can they be? They can even be at a distance of a huge distance away. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Beit Satayim mutal, yeter mi Beit Satayim asur. Only a space of Beit Satayim are they allowed to be in, but any more than that will be a problem. Amru le Rabbi Yehuda. So far, this doesn't really prove anything yet. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, don't you agree that in a deer, asar, muktzah, chatzer, remember these are all stables, the pen, the stable, the backyard, the front yard, all those spaces, even if it's a huge space, 5 kurim, 10 kurim, even that kind of space, it's allowed. Rabbi Yehuda says back to them, Amar lahem, zo mechitza ve'elu pasim. That's a mechitza. Those have walls. This is just pasim. It's a very weak, and we're going to get back to this later about Rabbi Yehuda's whole approach, that these mechitzot are very weak. They don't really work to allow things that other actual mechitzot might actually work to do. He sees a distinction between mechitza and pasim. But that's not important yet for our purposes. Here comes the important part. Third opinion, which we didn't see before. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, bor beit sa'atayim abeit sa'atayim mutar. If it's 2 se'ah by 2 se'ah, meaning it's square shaped, okay, it's a bit tricky here. 2 se'ah by 2 se'ah sounds a lot more than a beit se'ah, than beit sa'atayim, because it's 2 by 2. Most Mefarshim explain it's a mistake here. It doesn't mean 2 by 2. It means the area all together is a Beit Sa'atayim, but it's in a square formation, then he says it's mutal. So he says, as long as the bore is a Beit Sa'atayim by Beit Sa'atayim, meaning as long as it's one, like the whole area is a Beit Sa'atayim, then it's allowed. And the whole issue of laharchik, that's just in order to have space for the parot, but that space isn't important to us. So what do you see here? Hami de Ka'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, bor velo pasim, he clearly says, when we talk about the space of the Beit Sa'atayim, we mean specifically the bor, not the pasim. That's very clear that he's saying that. If that's what he's saying, and he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, because basically he's saying the measurement is a Beit Se'ah. What's the difference? The measurement is a Beit Sa'atayim, 2 Beit Se'ah. What's the difference? The difference is, do we count the Be'er, or do we not? Do we count only the Be'er, or do we also count the Pasim around? So from there one can infer, Michal de Rabbi Yehuda, bor upasim kamar. That must be the debate between them. In which case, Rabbi Yehuda must mean including the pasim around. But now the Gemara says, no, below. You don't necessarily have to read it this way. You could say, Rabbi Yehuda bor below pasim kamar. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda was also referring only to the bor, in which case the obvious question is, Ihachu, hainu Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Then they're basically both saying the same thing. So what's the answer? Ikabenayu arich v'katim. The difference between them is square-shaped or rectangular-shaped. Okay, now Rabbi Yehuda will say we're talking rectangular shape. Why rectangular shape? Because it was all learned out from the courtyard. The courtyard of the Mishkan was a rectangle. It was 50 by 100. So that's a rectangle. So therefore, his shape is, even if it's a rectangle. Rabbi Shimon says, no, it has to be square. Why he says that, it's not exactly clear to me. It seems it's possible it's specifically a square shape because he's talking about what a typical be'er is going to be square shaped. And maybe because of that, he says it has to be square, different from the chatzer. It's true, in the end, the measurements have to be the same. It has to get up to a Beit Sa'atayim, but the shape is different, okay? And that's where they differ, on the shape, but maybe they're both referring to the bore itself and not to the pasim around, in which case we don't end up with an answer to our question about Rabbi Yehuda. Another thing that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Klal amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, כל אוויר שתשמישו לדירה, כגון דיר בשר ומוקצה וחצר, אפילו בית 5 קורין או בית 10 קורין מותר. Okay, anything that is surrounded by a machitza for purposes of living, right? That the reason why you do it is for living space. Then it doesn't matter the size, you can carry within. Again, this is all, if it has walls, then carrying is allowed inside. It's not a reshut harabim. As opposed to the karpaf, which we don't treat as a reshut harabim, but we treat it as a karmeli. Midrabanan, we view it like a reshut harabim. We're not going to allow carrying in it. And he adds not just a karpaf. He says v'chol dira shetashmisha la'avir. Okay, right? As opposed to avir shetashmisha la'dira, here we have the dira shetashmisha la'avir. We learned this before. This is when you have a space that you're protecting just to protect you from the elements, from the rain, from the snow, from whatever's around outside, the wind. That, like the Borganim, remember we saw the Borganim yesterday, like these little huts that the Shomrim, the people who watched over the fields, the guards, set up these little huts. Those are not for living. You don't have stuff in there. They're really just for protecting you from the elements. So those, Kigon Borganim shebesadot, Beit Sa'atayim mutar, geter mi Beit Sa'atayim asur. Then again, they have this measurement of Beit Sa'atayim and not any more than that. Okay. Back to the next Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we're now going to see a very big debate between Rabbi Yeshua and the rabbis, and we're going to basically deal with that for most of today and how different sources connect to this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and it's something we saw already just the other day, Im haya derech reshut harabim mefasaktan, yisakena litzdadim, v'chachamim omrim eno tzarich. The big argument between them here is, if you have pasei biraot in the middle of the road with your be'er in the middle, and a lot of people walk through here. It's right in the middle of Reshut Harabim. We talked about maybe the Reshut Harabim narrows and you basically have to walk through this space. So Rabbi Yehuda says you have to pave a road next to it for people to walk through, because if many people walk through here, that cancels the machitza. According to the rabbis, they said, no, you don't need to. People walking through doesn't cancel a machitza. Now, today we're going to see all sorts of cases. Does it, doesn't it? Is this source according to the rabbis? Is it according to Rabbi Yehuda? We're going to try to see. Okay, and in Gefet this week, which is coming out today, El Shimoni specifically talks about this whole issue, and there's something that's very complicated in the sugya because Rabbi Yochanan seems to contradict himself, and it's not so clear because the Gemara doesn't pose it as a contradiction, and what's going on. There's big Tosfot on it. Some things aren't so clear according to the Pshat, so she goes into that. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but recommend it if your Hebrew is good to listen to that. There's what she claims is that there's a bit of a difference of approach. Maybe you can look at it. There's a conceptual issue going on here. Do we say that the mechitzot are very strong? And that's what the Gemara starts off with. Let's just read and then I'll go into it. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, we already read this. We learned this a few days ago. The Amrei Travayu, they both said, Kan hodiacha kochan shel mechitzot. Right? This is where the rabbis show how strong mechitzot are, that even if many people walk through here, we still view them as mechitzot. Okay, now according to this line, it sounds like these mechitzot, even though they're not really solid mechitzot, they work as mechitzot no matter what, even if lots of people are walking through there. And one approach is to say, mechitzot work. A different approach is to say, what are the mechitzot working to do? They're working to protect, right, to change the status of a public to a private, right? And then we're saying basically, mechitzot are super strong, that even if this is a serious public domain and people are walking through it, we can still say the mechitzot make it into a private domain. Another option is to say, and we're going to see all sorts of things alluding to this, that maybe the Reshut HaRabim in their day was not really viewed as such a strong Reshut HaRabim. Once you no longer have a Reshut HaRabim de'oraita, then you can allow lighter mechitzot, like these pasei biraot, to enable you to carry within a certain space. Because as soon as your Reshut HaYachid is weaker, your Reshut HaRabim, the public status is weaker, even if lots of people walk through, since it's not exactly a Reshut HaRabim proper, well, we can allow a weaker type of mechitza. So there's a difference of approach here that kind of underlies the sugya about you can read it in different ways. What's really at function here? Is that the mechitzot are viewed as super strong, or the Reshut HaRabim is viewed as somewhat weak? Okay, so we'll see that. So now it sounds like the mechitzot are very strong. So now, by the way, this idea is not directly mentioned. It's kind of underlying the sugya. It's not necessarily directly mentioned. So the Gemara asks, Kanu svirale? So from here you can learn, but does he hold that way? Now, we talked about Rabbi Elazar and we said he does hold this way, but now they're focusing on Rabbi Yochanan. V'hama Rabbi Bar Chana amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? The Rabbi Elazar was a few days ago. So now they say, but doesn't Rabbi Bar Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Yerushalayim ilmalei daltotea ninalot balayla? If it weren't that the gates of Jerusalem were locked at night, chayavin alei mishum reshut harabim. You would have been obligated mishum reshut harabim. In other words, even though there's walls inside, those walls are not significant. Why not? Yerushalayim there's lots of traffic. We know this to be today, right? Jerusalem is full of traffic. There's lots of people always going in and out of the city. And therefore, they cancel any mechitzot in the city. So theoretically, it should be Reshut HaRabim, but because it has walls that get locked at night, that turns it not into a Reshut HaRabim. But it sounds like the mechitzot are canceled out, the ones in the city, because lots of people walk through. So Ella kam v'lo svirale. You'd have to say that Rabbi Yochanan is saying, you can see how strong the rabbis view mechitzot, but he doesn't hold that way. Now they're going to say, V'rami de Rabbi Yehuda de Rabbi Yehuda, v'rami de Rabbanan de Rabbanan. Each of them contradict themselves in a different sugya. Where is that? Tanya. Yeter al kain, we've seen this before. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, misha hayulo shnei batim. Okay, all the more so, this is a different case relating to something he said previously. But in any case, what he says is more important. Misha hayulo shnei batim, mishnei tzidei Reshut HaRabim. If I own two houses on opposite sides of the street, and in the middle is Reshut HaRabim going through, now what would you say? According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabim bok imbo, no mechitzot should work in between these two houses. And according to the rabbis, it should be fine because, right, you own both houses on both sides. It should work. So here it appears the opposite. Rabbi Yehuda says, Oselo lechi mikam v'lechi mikanu, korah mikam v'korah mikam. Put up a beam, a cross beam in either place, right, on both sides, or a post, a side post, and that should work. V'nosei v'noten ba'emtza. Even though many people are walking through, how does that work? Amrulo. And what did the rabbis respond? Ein ma'arvim Reshut HaRabim b'kach. You can't do this in the middle of the public domain. So that seems very strange. In our case, the rabbis thought it was okay. In this case, they don't. So kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, kasha de Rabbanan, Rabbanan. Each one contradicts himself. So now they're going to have to explain why this case is different in both directions. Rabbi Yehuda lo kashya, hatem diika shtei mechitzot ma'aliyata, hachaleka shtei mechitzot ma'aliyata. In our case, pasei b'iraot, they're very weak mechitzos. Rabbi Yehuda says that doesn't work. But in the case of the two houses, you have two houses. Those are two solid walls. Those two solid walls can basically say we can make, if you add a lechi here, a lechi there, a korah there, a korah there, that can view this as one space. Then we don't care that lots of people are walking through. To Rabbanan nami lo kasha, it's also not difficult. You can say, hacha'i kashem arba mechitzot, hatam le kashem arba mechitzot. In the case of pasei b'iraot, you actually have 4 mechitzas. You have 4 walls. You have those posts. But, right, each side is surrounded by walls. Here, you only have 2 walls with a little marker, but the marker is just a marker. It's not strong enough to function like a mechitza to block off the public domain. So basically, each one views each situation differently. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Here's where the problem comes in with Rabbi Yochanan, the Tosfot's going to deal with, that I mentioned before. So first, we saw Rabbi Yochanan saying, Yerushalayim, if it weren't that the doors were closed at night, you'd be chayiv, it would be Reshut HaRabim. Now he says, Eretz Yisrael ein chayavin alav mishum Reshut HaRabim. Now this sounds very strange. A minute ago, he just said Yerushalayim theoretically is Reshut HaRabim. Here he says all of Israel is not Reshut HaRabim. Okay? There's no real Reshut HaRabim in Israel. This is a fascinating statement. Okay? We'll try to figure this out. And interestingly, the Gemara doesn't say it contradicts the previous statement, and we're going to have to see why. Again, like I said, I'm not going to get into this, but the Tosfot deals with this. Yativ Rav Dimi v'ka'amar la lahashmata. So Rav Dimi was teaching what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Remember who everybody is. Rabbi Yochanan lives in Israel. Rav Dimi is the one who brings the Torah of Israel to Bavel, to Abaye, particularly in this case. And he says this, and Abaye says to him, Amar le Abaye le Rav Dimi, my time. What's the reason? Ilema, is it, if you want to say, and Abaye tries to say, I don't get it. If you want to say, Mishum de makif la suma de tzor mehachgisa, umachtena de gader mehachgisa, okay, and the Steinsaltz explain it's the Rosh Hanikra cliffs on the north side and the Golan Heights on the east side of the Yarden. Maybe it's that, and that basically creates these walls in all of the land. Okay, basically, so there's mechitzot on 2 sides, and that basically says this is not a Reshut HaRabim. If that's the case, well, we would have the same thing in other places. Okay, for example, Bavel Nami, Matkif la Prat Mehaigisa, V'diglat Mehaigisa. We have the Tigris and the Euphrates on both sides. And remember, we learned that water also creates walls because it's 10 tefachim deep, and that also could create a wall, right? Depths create also the semblance of a wall. So that would be the same. And then let's go even farther, says Abai. Tekulehama nakif, nami makif ukianus. Says we all live on continents that are surrounded by water, by oceans. So everywhere theoretically should not be a Reshut HaRabim. This is fascinating, right? We've been discussing all this Reshut HaRabim and how do you fix it, all that, right? Or how do you fix a mavud that's open to Reshut HaRabim? So obviously he's suggesting it sounds like there's no Reshut HaRabim. So what does he suggest? Dilma ma'alot u'moradot ka'amarta, right? We know that Israel is very hilly and that there's always ups and downs. And maybe what he means is not necessarily everywhere in Israel, but wherever there's aliyot and yiridot. Okay, those aliyot and yiridot, those ups and downs, those, right, that really there's only Reshut HaRabim in a flat space. Okay, it has to be plains. Now, why would that be? Because it's like the Diglei Midbar, right? It's like in the desert. Remember, we learn all these laws from the desert. In the desert, there weren't hills and mountains, right? It was just flat where they were living. So what's Rav Dimi's reaction? So basically, Abai is saying maybe this explains Rabbi Yochanan. So comes Rav Dimi and he says, Karpafna. Okay, you actually says you have a skull. Okay, you skull head, which basically means, according to Rashi, you're an important person. Chazite l'reshach be'amudei. I saw your head between the pillars. Ki amar Rabbi Yochanan lahashmata. I saw your head between the pillars, and Rabbi Yochanan said this in the Beit Midrash, meaning you didn't come up with this on your own, but you actually heard Rabbi Yochanan say this. Okay, now there's a bit of a problem with this. Abai lived in Babylonia. He never, as far as we know, he never came to Israel. He never sat in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was also 2 generations above him. It could be they overlap time-wise, but unlikely. Some people say that there's all different explanations. Maybe Rabba, who was his adoptive father, who was his teacher. We know, we have some sources that he learned with Rabbi Yochanan on a one-off. So maybe it was him and that he's kind of saying you must have learned it from Rabba. Or maybe he's not saying you actually learned it, but maybe he's saying you're so smart that you figured out what Rabbi Yochanan himself said. Okay, it's as if you were there, theoretically. Okay, this is why it's important to understand history in order to understand what the Gemara is talking about, because otherwise you would have just read it and said, oh, I guess he was in the yeshiva when Rabbi Yochanan was teaching it. Some people actually think that maybe he really was there. Okay, they understand it literally. Either which way, we're going to see now that Rabbi Yochanan actually said this himself. That either Rabin said this or Rabbi Avau said it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Either both of them said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And here we have it explicitly. It's not like they camped in the desert. And this Rabbi Yochanan says, and therefore it's wherever, right, wherever in Eretz Israel where there's aliyot and yeridot, all those places, right, where there's a valley or a mountain range, those are not going to be considered like, they're not going to be treated as Reshut HaRabim. So now Rechava asked Rava the following question, and the issue is going to be, okay, we'll see, we'll get to it inside. Okay, this is a picture we've seen in the past, where you basically have a mound of dirt that goes 4 amot across. I'm looking in a different page on Daf Yomi. It's picture number 128. You have a mound of dirt or a hill, a mound, that basically it goes up 10 tfachim with a slope of 4 amot. Okay, this would be Reshut HaRabim because it has 4 amot of width and 10 amot of height. So it would be its own private domain, but it's in the public space. Okay, so now the question is, right, remember, what does it mean, 10 mitoch arba? That it's not, let's say, it goes up 10 for every 5 cubits. Let's give an example. If it's 5 cubits, then it's already less steep. If it's less steep, then we don't treat this as its own individual space. It's not a Reshut Yachid. And also think about it. The steeper something is, the harder it is for people to climb up it. If it's harder for people to climb up, then it already makes it less of a public space. Because again, let's say you're walking on the street and there's a big mound and there's also flat. Where are you going to go? You're going to go on the flat, not on the big mound. Unless, of course, you're on a hike, and then some people prefer to take the more challenging route. But we're assuming you're walking on the street, you're not on a hike, because a hike wouldn't be a Reshut HaRabim generally. So the question is, if you have this telam mitlaket 10 mitoch arba, berabim bokim bo, but yet, even though it's a steep area, it happens to be a space where a lot of people walk through. Chayavin alav mishum Reshut HaRabim or en chayavin alav? Is this Reshut HaRabim or not? Now this is exactly, or it seems exactly, like our Mishnah. Because what did we say? The rabbis will say, I don't care that a lot of people are going through. This has all the criteria of a Reshut Yachid. It should be a Reshut Yachid. So he says to him, right, why would he ask a question? Rechava would ask Rava a question that's explicit in the Mishnah. So therefore, he says, Aliba de Rabbanan lo tibayilach. According to the rabbis, obviously that's not the question. Because hashta umat hatam denicha tashmishte. In the case of our Mishnah, when you're walking on the street and there just happen to be some posts and a be'er in the middle, there it's pretty easy to walk through. And yet, and yet the rabbis don't think that it cancels out the mechitza. Still think this is a private domain, even though it's so easy to pass right through. So here, when it's this big mound, which is really not comfortable to walk up, of course, lo koshaken, of course they're going to think this is a private domain. Okay, the logic would say, they would say this, so obviously you can't be asking the question according to that. Kiti bailach, you must be asking the question, aliba de Rabbi Yehuda. And then what would be the question? Now, Rabbi Yehuda in Pasei Biraot says, Rabim Bok Imbo cancels your mechitza. So now will we say like this? My hatamhu denicha tashmishte. There it cancels your mechitza because it's very easy for people to walk through. But hachahu delo nicha tashmishte. But here it's not so comfortable for people to walk up this mound right in the middle of the road, and therefore maybe Rabbi Yehuda would say in this case lo ate rabim umevatle mechitza odilma loshna. So would he say this isn't going to cancel out the mechitza, the fact that a lot of people walk through here, or maybe it is anyway? So Amalei, what does Rabbi answer? Chayavin. What does it mean, chayavin? It means this is not a Reshut Yachid. The fact that even Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks there, it's still a Rabbi Yehuda, who thinks there that the Rabbim cancel the mechitza, will also think that here, okay? That it cancels the mechitza, which means if you carry within, you're going to be obligated. It's not a private domain. So now, they're now going to say, Va'afilu olin lo b'chevel. What if to get up this mound, you need to hold on to ropes, okay? And then already it's even more difficult. but still a lot of people go through here, Amarlein, still going to be the same. If a lot of people walk through, it doesn't make a difference. It's not going to be Reshut HaYachid. Ve'afilu b'ma'alot Beit Maron. What about if it's a long, windy road that you can only go one by one? Okay, single file. Where does this come up? In Netana Tokef. Okay, we're getting up to Yom Kippur. It's good. It's Yud Elul, Yud, right? It's Yud today, or I don't remember if it's Yud Aleph. But anyway, we're getting to Netana Tokef. It says we go before God, Kivnei Maron. What is Bnei Maron? There's many different interpretations, but one of them is based on this. Maron was a place with windy paths, and it was steep, windy paths. And steep, windy paths, you can only go single file, and that's how we go in front of God, single file. Okay, some people say it's like sheep, it's right, but there's different interpretations. This is one of them. So Amar Le'in, still, if a lot of people pass through, it doesn't matter if they go single file, it doesn't make a difference. It cancels out the mechitzas. So now they're going to bring a bunch of questions on Rava based on this. Eitive. If you have a courtyard is private, but people go in one door and out the other, and a lot of people walk through this chatzer, it's considered Reshut Harabim L'tum'ah. Okay, we talked about this before. If there's Safek Tumah, you're not sure if there's something Tameh in the Reshut Harabim or not. If it's in Reshut Harabim, a public domain, we're going to count it as Tahor. We're going to say we don't worry about Safek Tumah in the public domain. We only worry about a Safek Tumah in the private domain. So for the purposes of Reshut Harabim, for the purposes of, purity and impurity laws, if it's a doubtful case of doubt, we're going to treat it as a public domain. But Reshut HaYachid is Shabbat. But when it comes to Shabbat, we're going to say this is a private domain. Now, the Gemara is going to have to figure out who is this according to. Remember, we're bringing this as a contradiction to Rabbah, who said this tale is going to be Chayav, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, right? That Rabbi Yehuda is going to view this tale as a Reshut HaRabim. So Mani, Ilema Rabbanan, if you're going to say this follows the rabbis, who basically say, we still consider these walls even though people pass through. Well, there would be no point to tell us this law according to the rabbis. It would be very obvious. Because when it's in the middle of the street and they still say the mechitzot count as mechitzot, that people walking through doesn't cancel it. Here, where it's going through someone's private courtyard, where it's obviously less, right, there's going to be less traffic there. It's not so easy to walk through there. Lo kol shekain. Of course, they're going to think the chatzir mechitzot are still mechitzot, and therefore elalav Rabbi Yehuda. It must be this is Rabbi Yehuda. And what do you see? That when it's on the side, and as Rabbi Yehuda would only say when it's in the middle of the street and everybody passes through. But if it's a chatzir or this mound where it's already not so usable, then even though people still walk through, that maybe isn't going to cancel. And therefore, this would be a contradiction to what he said, to what Rava claims, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there would be, it would cancel the mechitza. So they say, Lo, olam Rabbanan. No, really, you could say this is Rabbanan, but our whole question, isn't it obvious? What did he want to teach us? Reshut harabim l'tum'ah, that when it comes to impurity laws, we're going to treat it as a public domain. So even though we're going to treat it as private for carrying, we're going to treat it as public for tumah. Okay, and that's probably in order to be lenient. Okay, since it's not, right, it's got both dimensions to it. So when it comes to purity, we're going to treat it, right, and be more lenient about laws of purity. So for that, it's and that's why he had to say it, because he wanted to teach us that halacha. And it's going to be the same answer for the next one. Tashma, we finally get to our picture for today. Tashma, our one picture number 136. Okay, here you have a Reshut HaRabim, if you see, a mavoy. It's open on one side to the public, and on the other side, there's a big bore in the middle. Okay, a big pit that covers, if you see here, covers almost the entire space with a little space on the side for people to walk by. So, mavuot hamifulashot biborot b'shichinu b'ma'arot, meaning it's open on both sides, but on one side it's got either a pit or a ditch or a cave or something basically blocking. Okay, some sort of structure blocking it. Okay, it could be in the ground, could be above ground. Reshut HaYachid l'Shabbat, we're going to treat it as private for Shabbat, right? And assuming you fix the mavoy, u'reshut right, with a lechi or a korah on the other side, u'reshut harabim l'tumah. So it's going to be private for Shabbat, but public when it comes to impurities that are found here. So first the Gemara says, what do you mean biborot? It's open with a ditch or with a pit. That doesn't make any sense. Sakadatach. Ela liborot. It means into a bore, meaning exactly as we saw in the picture. So Rishud Yachid l'Shabbat, Rishud Eruvin l'Tumah. So Mani, who does this go according to? Ilema Rabbanan, if it goes according to the rabbis, again, same question. When it's very easy for people to walk through because it's in the middle of the street, the Pasebi Ra'ot, Amre Lo Ate Rabim U'Mavat Leila. So Hacha, and yet we don't say the people cancel out the status. So Hacha Deloni Chatashmishte, because it's in a mavoi, it's in an alley, where of course, less people are going to walk through Lo Kol Shekain, obviously. Elalav Rabbi Yehuda, so we must be Rabbi Yehuda, and what do you see? Right? Rabbi Yehuda says, this is Rishud Yachid, he would say the same thing with this mound of Telamit Laket. So they say, lo, same answers. Before lo, olam Rabbananu, Rishud Arabim l'Tumah, Itzri Chalei. The Chiddush was l'Inyan Tumah. Next law, Tashma. Let's learn it from this source. Shvilei Beit Gilgul, the Chayotze Behem. The roads of Beit Gilgul, which seems like they're also narrow, steep roads. Rishud Yachid l'Shabbat, Rishud Arabim l'Tumah. Ve'ezehu Shvilei Beit Gilgul. What are these? Amri Debei Rabbi Yanai, Kol she'ena Eved Yachol Litol Se'al Shel Chitim V'Yarutz Lefnei Sardio. It's a case where it's a road that it's so hard to run that if you're running away from a Roman officer, remember like Elisha Baal Knafayim was running away from him, you're running away from a Roman officer and you're carrying some stuff, you won't be able to run very, very, very fast. So now, this is considered, according to this again, Rishud Yachid l'Shabbat, but Rishud Eruvin l'Tumah. So again, Mane, Ilema, the same structure as before. If you say Rabbanan, Hashta, Mahatam, Denicha Tashmisha, where it's easy to walk in the middle of the street, and yet the rabbis say, Amar Rabbanan lo atu rabim u'mavat le'le mechitzta. The majority people running through don't cancel your mechitza. Hacha de lo nicha tashmishte, here where it's really not comfortable to walk, lo kol shekain. So again, the answer, elalav Rabbi Yehuda, it must be Rabbi Yehuda. But again, they reject this and they say, and here's an interesting way to end. This is different than the previous. Shvilei Beit Gilgul shekamarta, what you're using, this is your example. Something, again, we saw before, Eretz Yisrael is unique because it has these uphills and downhills, and because of that, it's different, the status of Rishud Rabim. Here they say there's a big difference between Eretz Yisrael and not. Why? Yehoshua Ohev Yisrael Hayam. Yehoshua conquered the land. He loved the Jewish people. And what did he decide because of that? He paved roads and highways between cities. Any place that was easy for people to walk, Misara l'Rabim. He basically said this is public property, right? He was the area that defines, right? The municipality defines, is this public space, is it private space, right? Can you build a house here or not? So Yeshua did that. Any place that was easy for people to go, he said that belongs to the public. But any space that was hard to walk, he basically said this is for individual use. He wanted individuals to have their own space. So he basically said any place that it's hard for people to walk through, we're not going to make that public, we're going to make it private. And because of that, this Beit Gilgal is unique. It's not like it teaches us anything about a tale that's, in the middle of somewhere outside of Israel. But in Israel, specifically, this Beit Gilgal place had its own unique status. Okay, it's a very interesting thing. Anyway, we'll move on from that because we want to finish. Last part for today, very simple because we already learned this. Rabbi Akiva's approach distinguishes between a bor and a be'er, but only when it comes to public versus private. He says the one case Pasebi Ra'ot don't work is in a individual bor. And why? Rashi says, and this connects with things we've seen before, because bor harabim ipaske maya, what's the whole thing with the bor? It's rainwater, it might dry up. We're worried people will then carry here even when there's no water. And now they say, ipaske maya, if the water stopped, if there was no water, people would remind each other. But if it's owned by an individual, there's no one to remind the individual. This is like the candle, two people reading from the candle. We saw this a few times. Ben Bava Omer, Ein osim pasin ela lebe'er harabim bilvad. Pasebi road is only for public and only for be'erot that have fresh water always coming in. Ulish'ar osim chagura gavoa sarat tvachim. But for other ones, you use ropes in order, right? You make a mechitza really out of ropes. Again, less than 3 tvachim in between, lavud, and height of 10. And that's how you do it. The Pasebi Ra'ot don't work for anything else, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Just to go back to Rabbi Yeshua, Gita pointed out that maybe I didn't stress this enough, but Yeshua is described as Noed Yisrael because he wanted to make everything accessible. That was his whole idea. He wanted things to be as accessible as possible, and therefore did it in this way. Okay, with that, we will end. Have a good day, everybody.